We are, as a nation, sort of uniquely diffident. If you look at the small ads in an American journal, you'll say, handsome, slim, non-smoker wants. In the British equivalent is chain-smoking, alcoholic, out of work, overweight, chap, age 50, wants. There is a great weight of tradition that will tend to humiliate the male.
Well, Happy New Year, everyone. Today marks New Year's Day. Forget what you thought was January. 2026 begins here. I'm delighted to be joined on the My Martin Amis podcast by the Irish writer Rob Doyle. Rob, you are a Dublin-born Irish novelist. Under your belt sit 3 novels, a collection of short stories, 1 work of non-fiction, and 2 edited anthologies. Your latest novel, Cameo, was published on the 22nd of January and is out as listeners hear this. How's it been so far, touring the book?
Really good, yeah. I mean, I'm here in London doing a couple of events and, lots of press lined up. So, I mean, I can't complain. I think as publication approached for this book, I had this feeling that I've been away for a while, my last novel was 6 years ago. I had one short book a year after that, but you start to wonder, God, is anybody still going to care? Is there going to be interest? Plus, I'm that much maligned thing now, which is a male writer in my 40s, and you start wondering, God, is that the age when people start to kind of ignore you or something, You get these thoughts as publication approaches. However, that hasn't been the case, and it seems there's quite lively interest in it. So things are looking good. I feel pretty positive about it all.
With an intro like that, you'd have thought we were going to be launching into a discussion about the information, the angst of the writer in his 40s. Will anyone care? Does anyone care? But actually, you said in the late noughties and early 2010s, you were fixated on Amis's big 3 novels, Money, London Fields, and The Information. But for this episode, you've chosen to hone in on London Fields. About 6 years ago, you wrote in the Irish Times that the novel's architectonic splendour, visions of megacity entropy and unremitting lingual charisma put it damn near the summit of modern novelistic achievement. Do you still feel that way?
100%, yeah. I'm glad you consulted that piece. That was as part of a column I wrote every year in the Irish Times. I think it was called In Praise of Older Books. Every week I would write about an old book, a pre-2000 novel that really had meant a lot to me or influenced me as a writer or given me some kind of download, some kind of cognitive download that has kind of shaped my worldview ever since. And London Fields was kind of a no-brainer. I mean, the first thing I should say is it's the very first Martin Amis book I've ever read. I've read pretty much, if not all, most of it, by now. But that was the very first one.
So First Love.
First Love.
But on revision, still you think the best?
Yeah, I do, yeah. I probably reread the book in its entirety maybe 3 times in my life. It's one of his long novels. Arguably too long. We could say that about Money, we could say it about The Information, and we could say it about London Fields. Maybe 1 or 2 of the others as well. And I know people who will argue that more virulently than I will. Its bagginess doesn't really bother me. But yeah, I think it was the one I read, and I wasn't the most, at the time, I didn't have a great reading of, a great knowledge of contemporary fiction, contemporary literature. I had just finished my studies in philosophy, and for several years, I had studied psychoanalysis too, and for several years I had read next to no modern fiction. Next to no fiction. I was deep in philosophy and deep in ideas. And I almost kind of lost the ability to read fiction for a time because its artifices of scenes and characters and so on seemed a bit too slow and a bit long-winded for the kind of training I had given my mind of getting straight to the core of the essence of the idea. But then, of course, I came back to fiction. And I was in Thailand, of all places, or at least in Southeast Asia. I can't remember exactly where. I was doing this kind of backpacker trail. I was out there for best part of a year. And, when you go to these places, these hostels and so on, you're staying in hostels, and a lot of them have these book exchanges, where You go in, you stay a few nights, and you leave whatever book you're reading on the shelf and you take another one, which turns out to be a really good way to read, at least for a period, because you get outside of the ghetto of your own prejudices and your own tastes, and you're exposed to chance, and you see books you won't otherwise have seen. I first read Jeff Dyer that way too, in India the following year when I was still traveling around. I know you've interviewed Jeff for this podcast, but it was Martin Amis's London Fields, which I stumbled upon in a hostel in Southeast Asia. Read it mostly on a series of very long bus journeys, you know, these 20-hour bus journeys through the jungle hills that you do out there. And it was an electrical storm in my brain of pleasure, hilarity, delight, and a kind of astonishment. And the astonishment was related primarily to language and its possibilities. It's, to me, hitherto unsuspected possibilities. I didn't know language could do that.
So let's back up just a moment. You grew up in Dublin and at some stage moved to London. Did you travel to Southeast Asia between those two locations?
Yes.
So before you'd really lived in London, you were reading London Fields on a bus in Southeast Asia. What was the experience of that like, given the context?
I mean, I suppose in hindsight, what I would say about it is it kind of amplified and intensified the kind of apocalyptic sci-fi dimension that is there in London Fields, you know, in the sense that I didn't have as much of a kind of actual visual read on the scenes and the streets in the cities he was describing. You know, now I know London well and I've lived here for several years, but then I had only visited London a few times. So mostly when I was reading, I was living purely in Martin Amis's hyper-real, hysterical, apocalyptic, dystopian vision of London, entropic vision of London. So I guess that aspect of it was heightened for me. But moreover, regardless of the city that it was set in, it was just such a blizzard of ideas as well. And that's something that's always appealed to me in Amis. Now, we could debate how philosophically sophisticated he is or how interesting and original his ideas really are when you drill down into it. But the fact is, you know, most of the time he was at least attempting to engage with ideas and philosophy, geopolitics, all sorts of stuff.
And it satisfied, did it, this pull towards ideas in you at the time? This novel kind of gave you that nourishment? It
did. Now, it's not so much that most fiction, I found it wanting, you know, that it left a lot wanting. It's more that the way my brain had become trained and structured was I kind of had this need to get to the point all the time, to get straight to the essence and more so to the ideas. And a lot of fiction isn't concerned with ideas, and maybe that's fine, you know. These days I'm not always drawn to fiction that's informed as much by ideas, maybe more so by images. The image has taken on a kind of primacy in my imaginative life now and in my fictional reading life. But at the time, ideas were what I wanted. You know, I was 23 at the time. And like I say, only really deciding to kind of explore fiction, you know, contemporary fiction in a way I simply hadn't done. I just wasn't informed. I hadn't gone down that route in my life before that. I was reading a lot, but not contemporary fiction.
I have to say, I can relate very closely to what you're saying. In fact, we are recording this today in a flat part owned by a mutual friend of ours, Andy West, the author of The Life Inside, who I went to university with to study philosophy. And I would say that probably my love of Martin Amis came from a similar place, that here was a modern novelist who could deal with big ideas and make you laugh out loud.
Yeah.
What sort of ideas did you find in London Fields hit those nerves for you?
What really leaps out at me now as soon as you say that is I remember vividly the first time I read it, but there's a kind of riff he goes on there. It's something relating to anal sex, and to be even more specific, I think the female anus, and he brings in kind of astrophysics, black holes, quantum indeterminacy, all sorts of stuff, and you know, it goes on for about a page. I can't remember exactly where he goes with it, but I just remember reading reading this section and thinking to myself, is he really talking about what I think he's talking about here? With a kind of a rising sense of gleeful hilarity in me, going, God, he's doing this and he's keeping a straight face, which is kind of encapsulates so much of what I love and have always loved about Amos, is that collapsing of the very highest with the very lowest, what the American president would call locker room talk, you know, the kind of the gnarliest conversations that go down in the pubs of London or wherever, you know, with astrophysics, with all kinds of speculations about the nature of time and chance and destiny and so forth. But also, I would say the kind of structural ideas that are embedded in the novel. You know, it's to call it postmodern is at once accurate and maybe slightly off-putting, because often I think, you know, postmodern now just sounds old-fashioned, but when it didn't sound old-fashioned as a descriptor, I think it did often suggest or denote a kind of dryness, a dry cerebral quality. And I don't get that in Amos. He's not dry. He's anything but dry. I mean, it's vivid, it's hilarious. And we can't ignore the importance of the humor of it, you know, that sense that you're getting access to deep psychological intimacies and painful, awkward truths about the way things are, particularly between men and women, but also between men and men alone with themselves. But even as it's darkest and bleakest and most kind of awkward and most uncomfortable, it's always very, very, very funny. But the ideas that are embedded in the novel in terms of its structure, it's kind of constant complicating of the very artifice of fiction itself, the borders of fiction, the relationship between the real and the fictional, all of these things, which in lesser hands could indeed be kind of dry, too academic. They're all in there, but they're completely alive within this novel, I think. And in other, you know, of Amos's best works, to a lesser degree, perhaps in Money. But he really makes these things come alive and makes it fascinating. I think the great thing about London Fields is that it's the kind of book I could recommend to, you know, my dad or to whichever friend, you know, who isn't maybe as fascinated or engaged with contemporary literature or with philosophy or with ideas or whatever. But it's the kind of book that can be appreciated and will be appreciated by the average reader, let's say. But also, if you happen to be fascinated by all of this loftier stuff, it will appeal to that person as well.
You mentioned recommending it to your dad, recommending it to a friend. Could you recommend it to, say, your mother or sister? This is where it becomes more complicated, of course. The only other guest on this series to choose London Fields was Janan Ganesh, the FT columnist.
I'm a fan of his columns, yeah.
He differs on whether or not the cosmology anal sex moment in the novel really works, but he does see eye to eye with you on the status of Keith Talent in the English canon. You've called him your favorite fictional character. Should we talk a little bit about him?
I would love to talk about Keith Talent, and that's in a sense what this whole conversation has been leading up to. I'm glad I can bond with Janan Ganesh about this across time and space. You know, I take a lot of pleasure in reading his columns. So, but yeah, Keith Talent is, I mean, look, to bring it back to the fact, like, even to mention again this thing about the cosmology and anal sex chapter, whether or not it works in some kind of objective sense, or, you know, whether or not it holds up, you've got to bear in mind, I was reading this at 23 and I was so primed just for this kind of, even if it didn't work, it was the sheer daring of it and the kind of bravado and the unlikeliness of it and that sense of just kind of, you get this on every page of that book, but you have a sense of an author in absolute command of his craft, of the English literary tradition, of the sheer potency and power of the sentence.
Perhaps we can make the first reading that particular passage, and you can get a sense then of whether or not it really does resonate with you as much now as it did when you were 23.
Perfect.
But for now, Keith.
Yeah, so at 23, all of this stuff was so kind of revelatory. And then when I got to Keith Talent and as his story unfolded, and of course, you know, Keith is this darts player, this unreconstructed lumpen proletariat kind of criminal, lifelong criminal who's utterly amoral and cheerfully parasitical upon the social order and corrosive on the social order, and is kind of a complete nightmare, but there's something incredibly innocent and lovable about him at the same time, just as there was in a similar way with John Silf in the previous great Martin Amis novel, Money. But I think what makes Keith Talent work is the complete conviction that he has and that he acts with in terms of his own not even amorality, his immorality, and the kind of cheerful dedication he has to being the worst person he can be, and his complete and total alienation from the kind of bourgeois proprieties and ethics and etiquette that are kind of embedded in this, implied within this work of literary fiction, and no doubt in the value system of most people who read it, because reading ambitious contemporary literary fiction is kind of a class-coded act, and Keith Talent is a profoundly non-middle class character, a non-bourgeois character. But it's an understatement, of course, to say that Amis doesn't treat him with a kind of patronizing sentimentalism. He's kind of ridiculing Keith Talent viciously on every page and giving himself full license to do that, while at the same time doing it in such a way that magically, like I said, this bizarrely lovable, even adorable figure emerges from it. So it's a strange one, what he pulls off with this character.
He ridicules all of his male characters in some way, I think.
Yeah.
But would you say that where you have the duality in London Fields of Keith Talent on the one hand and Guy Clinch on the other, you sense that Guy Clinch would hate to read what Martin Amis had written about him, that he would be much more sensitive to the criticism. The thing that I think allows Keith Talent to emerge victorious is because you know that Keith Talent wouldn't give a fuck what Martin Amis thinks of him.
Yeah.
And that's kind of the beauty of the character.
And it's his invincibility. And
Martin Amis, with all of the tools in his toolkit to take somebody down and deconstruct them, it wouldn't faze Keith Talent one bit.
Yeah, if anything, he would glory in it, and he would wallow in it, and he would, the worse he comes across, the better, because it would make a better story down the pub, with the lads, with his mates who are called great names like Fucker Burke. He's the Irish guy, and I can't even remember some of the, he's got this whole kind of mixed race gang of mates all involved in various levels of criminal activity.
When you were on that bus in Southeast Asia reading this novel for the first time, did you have any reference point whatsoever for a Keith Talent? I happen to know that you grew up in the same part of Dublin as Conor McGregor. You knew of people who perhaps were of the rough and tumble life, prone to violence, immune to bourgeois niceties and civilities. Did you find it easy to construct Keith Talent in your mind despite not having spent much time in London or England?
I found it incredibly easy. I could see him, more so than I could see Guy Clinch, actually, strangely. I always felt, for me, the temperature always went down a little bit when Guy Clinch came on the page. His story is engaging enough and so on, and it's all good, but it just doesn't have that same brilliance and that same vividness and that comic intensity of the Keith Talent scenes. And so Keith Talent, I went to school with people like that, and I'm not saying not necessarily career criminals on that level, but just with that kind of invincibility that you're talking about, that kind of don't give a fuck, completely being their most abrasive, toxic, self-serving selves and not giving a damn about it. And, completely cheerfully immune to questions of taste and good taste and anything like that. It's a character that will probably always be with us, I think the difference with Amis, and this is what makes it so gleeful a read, is maybe other writers of Amis's social background, which I guess we could call upper middle class, would have been a bit too wary and a bit too afraid of coming across cruel or condescending or whatever, towards this person from the lower orders. Whereas Amis just kind of is clearly aware of all of these risks and all of these dangers and all of these potential criticisms, but then he just goes and does it anyway because he has that kind of air of arrogance and daring about him, which at its best makes him such an exhilarating read. And at its worst is probably the very quality that has turned so many people against him. Not least the women folk, as you suggested earlier. I mean, to go back to that question, I've never been able to recommend Amos to a female friend or a girlfriend or anything like that with the same success or the same effect as I have to a male friend. And we don't have to struggle too hard to figure out why that one is.
It's not impossible. It's just there's a lot less fluidity to that.
But just to jump in there, I think what it is partly, though, is that he just describes male humiliation, male emasculation, male indignities so very, very well and so wickedly and with such intimacy that, you kind of have to be a man to feel on a kind of gut level, on a cellular level, exactly how forensically accurate that stuff is, and hence the fascination he has for so many men. And I think across the board that has been the case, even at his peak, by no means exclusive, obviously, but I'd say the majority of his truly impassioned readers have been men.
You also wrote in that Irish Times piece from 2019, quote, Amos's women may be paper-thin objects of desire, but his men are all in hell. What is this hell, this veil of tears that Martin Amis so often whips up around his male characters?
Particularly in this novel, in London Fields, I think the word I'd come back to again is humiliation. But now that I say it, it would be even more fitting and more apt for his later novel, The Information. A novel that at times, even though it's very funny too, is almost too dark and too painful for me to read comfortably. It's kind of the even darker side of the already very dark earlier novels, Money and London Fields. But I think when you really drill down into the kind of worldview and the value system and even the ideology, the metaphysics, whatever we want to call it, that is embedded and implied in the work of Martin Amis as a whole, to me, a very brutal picture does begin to emerge. And it's a picture in which there are very much the haves and the have-nots. And this applies not only to socioeconomic factors, but to sexuality, to charisma, to kind of everything, And so you have these repeatedly drawn and enforced hierarchies, and there's always a winner and there's always a loser. But most of the fascination in the writing is with the loser and with the failure and the one who fails, the one who loses. There's a quote by Norman Mailer where he said, whenever two men say hello to each other on the street, one of them loses. And that's there in Amos all the time, I think. Somebody is always coming off worse and being wounded by it and then living in the repercussions and the consequences of their wounds, their psychosexual wounds. And because, as with so many, great novelists, sexuality is such a throbbing heart in the Amos world, in the Amos fictional universe, the agonies and the torments and the hells that the men find themselves in his work is always intimately related to sex. Sex, obviously the source of rapturous and blissful pleasures in this earth, but also the source of cruel, brutal agonies, mortifications, humiliations, betrayals, revenge, all of this stuff. And I think a lot of authors of his generation, like Hanif Qureshi, male authors in particular, Hanif Qureshi, people like that, Amos was always obsessively honing in on sexual mortification, sexual humiliation, and all of the kind of torments and agonies and jealousies that go with it. And, we haven't even talked yet about Nicola Six, and she's the other figure in this triad.
Well, let's talk about her in just a moment.
Yeah.
But not before we've heard the passage referred to earlier.
Yes.
To the extent that this passage came to mind at the top of this conversation, I imagine that you feel that Nicholas Six plays an important and telling role in the novel. Again, this would put you at variance with Janan Ganesh, who felt that she was an unnecessary distraction, that it would be enough for there to be a loser and a winner in an exchange of hellos between Keith Talent and Guy Clinch without Nicholas Six complicating that.
Interesting, because if we take that up and run with it, we could look at the information, the major novel, let's say, that came next, as, in a sense, London Fields without Nicholas Six.
Absolutely.
Yeah, you've just got the joust, the antagonism between two rival males, and the hatred and the fear and the pain that ensues. And yeah, I guess there is an argument to be made that Nicholas Six is extraneous. I mean, for sure, she's not in any sense a rounded, living character. She is paper thin. She doesn't convince. So yeah, I can see the argument.
Let's delve into that in just a moment.
Okay. The black hole, so long predicted in theory, was now, to Nicola's glee, established astronomical fact. Cygnus X1. It was a binary system. The black hole was orbiting a star 30 times the mass of our sun. The black hole weighed in at 10 solar masses, but was no wider than London. It was nothing. It was just a hole. It had dropped out of space and time. It had collapsed into its own universe. Its very nature prevented anyone from knowing what it was. Unapproachable, unilluminable. Nothing is fast enough to escape from it. For Mother Earth, the escape velocity is several miles per second. For Jupiter, 37 miles per second. For the Sun, 383 miles per second. For Sirius B, the first white dwarf they found, the escape velocity is 4,900 miles per second. But for Cygnus X1, the black swan, there is no escape velocity. Even light, which propagates at 186,287 miles per second, cannot escape from it. That's what I am, she used to whisper to herself after sex. A black hole. Nothing can escape from me. Sodomy pained Nicola, but not literally. It was its local prevalence, as it were, that pained her so greatly. It was the only thing about herself that she couldn't understand and wouldn't forgive. How generally prevalent was it, and an unwanted humiliation, this, to seek safety in numbers. It wasn't like masturbation, which everyone secretly knew, everyone secretly did, apart from the odd fanatic or ostrich or liar. Masturbation was an open secret until you were 30. Then it was a closed secret. Even modern literature shut up about it at that point, pretty much. Nicola held this silence partly responsible for the industrial dimensions of contemporary pornography. Pornography, a form in which masturbation was the only subject. Everybody masturbated all their lives. On the whole, literature declined the responsibility of this truth. So pornography had to cope with it, not elegantly or reassuringly, as best it could.
So I don't know when the last time you read that passage was, but when you do read it, do memories come flooding back?
The experience of reading Martin Amis for me has changed down the years and has grown older. And for one thing, I just don't read Martin Amis as frequently, as intensely, as passionately as I used to. I mean, there was a period when I was 23 and I was in Southeast Asia and I read London Fields. A few years later, I found myself living in London. And my good friend Andy, whose flat we're currently sitting in, I was getting to know him around the time. And we would kind of walk around London talking about books and novels and our literary aspirations and so on. And often talking about Martin Amis. And that was really the peak. I'd say I was about 26 at the time. And that was the absolute peak of my fascination with Martin Amis, who was, of course, still alive at the time. I remember going to see him a couple of times, reading and talking about his work here in London. And I distinctly remember once I was living in Manor House in northeast London. And I remember once walking by the canals, as I used to do then, and just after work or whatever, I used to go to the library to write. And but I would take these walks by the canals, and I remember walking by the canal and thinking, as usual, about some passage in Amos or some quote in Amos, and having this realization that at that time in my life, I was thinking more about Martin Amos than I was about any living figure in my life, including my girlfriend at the time. So I was fascinated. I was fixated, you know. So reading it there now, I was quite into it. I mean, I found it quite cluttered, and he's all the things people accuse him of being, which is show-offy, and he can be pretentious, and he can kind of bring in the loftiest concepts and facts and figures to kind of pad out his own, to kind of bestow a certain kind of depth and gravitas and dignity and sublimity onto his stuff, secondhand, as it were. And you know, I can see all sorts of things to criticize, but still, the language, even as I read it there, felt to me cracklingly alive. But what I was going to say about Amos is that one of the things that's changed for me as I've read him down the years is not just that I've grown older and grown more mature and written my own books, and, you know, my tastes have changed and branched out, but also I feel that his style has begun to very markedly and very noticeably decay and to age. And I think arguably his style is probably more prone to that than to some others, in that he was always trying to invigorate the language and to kind of supercharge the English sentence by going in all guns blazing, you know, firing on all cylinders at all times, and making style into a kind of religion. And, you know, when that works, as it so often did, what you get is something that's so much more insightful, confounding, surprising, and pleasure-giving than most writers are capable of. But it also makes it somehow uniquely susceptible to the process of aging.
And what about Nicola Six? How is she aged?
Well, bear in mind that even at the time, she was felt by many critics, particularly feminist critics, to be radically out of step with the times and the morals and the mores of the times. I think, wasn't there that whole semi or pseudo controversy whereby I think London Fields was a major favorite to win the Booker Prize, but I think two of the judges were, you know, avowed feminists, and they blocked it. You know, they stopped that from happening. So I mean, even at the time, I guess his portrayal of her was felt to be retrograde, and I can't imagine, you know, after the kind of feminist wars of the 2010s and the early 2020s, I can't imagine that that depiction would find much more favor now than it did then.
Perhaps not. And yet, we live in a world of OnlyFans and Bonnie Blue.
You could even say that the most lurid fantasies of the later Martin Amis, you know, the novels that even I didn't, as a major Amis fan, even I didn't appreciate or admire. But, you know, he went into some porno totalitarian landscapes that, you know, where his hyperbolic imagination was really kind of going on overdrive. But that was 20 years ago or so when he was writing those kind of books. And now, yeah, Bonnie Blue and OnlyFans, you know, the pornography of everything. Can't really even say it was so exaggerated anymore, you know. I'm
struck by the image you gave us earlier of you wandering along the canals in Manor House, an area of London that I happened to live in when I was of similar age, perhaps younger. In This Is the Ritual, your book published in 2016, there's a short story titled Martin Knows Me about an aspiring Derry novelist who worships Martin Amis and opens with the line, "Failure can be a kind of career, bitterness too." Could you tell us a little bit about what drove you to write this? Did you have to purge? Did you have to get it out? When you say you were thinking about Martin Amis more than any other figure, dead or alive.
Yeah, God, it's so long ago since I wrote that story, or since I've even read it. I wish I'd read it before doing this podcast just to jog my memory. All I remember is that at that period of my life, I was very intrigued with writer characters, using the writer as a fictional character, and particularly about mediocre, failing, desperate writers. I was, for whatever reason, I was drawing a lot of those at the time. I was engaged with kind of depicting them and their struggles. And
having read the information, presumably, at that point.
Definitely had read the information at least once. A book, again, which I found, even in memory, I found uniquely painful. I think that's kind of the black heart of Martin Amis, that novel. I think it must have come from a place of real collapse and pain for him.
Well, it's interesting you say that. He was up for the Booker Prize, didn't win it, and by many accounts felt a career-long bitterness about the fact that nearly all the accolades he received on the other side of the pond, that he never got his flowers in the UK. But you were particularly interested in the struggle of writers then, and that drove you to write this from a place, it sounds, that was very autobiographical.
The only part in that story, actually, that's really autobiographical, I think, is at the end of it. He goes to see Martin Amis at a talk in like the South Bank or something like that, or the British Library or something, and watches him talk. And I think he then goes up to say something to him, but I think he chickens out or something like that. And that was the only part that I kind of drew from real life. The rest of it was very much pure fiction. I mean, yeah, I was fixated on Amis, but not in the same, I think, kind of abject, pathetic way that my character was.
Did you freeze when it came to speaking to him?
I didn't freeze, but I never did go to speak to him. And there were a couple of occasions where I could have done. I mean, there was that one where I went to see him talk, and I think there was a signing afterwards, but I didn't queue up to get my book signed. Another time I was at the Boris Festival in Ireland, which is a kind of festival of literature and ideas and so on. And everybody stays in this kind of big old house, this mansion in the countryside, for a lovely long weekend of talks and events and so on. So you're kind of, everybody is, having breakfast together, and all the guests, the great and the good, are there. They get a lot of big names, not just writers. You'll have members of Pink Floyd or all sorts, these kind of things. All sorts of figures are around. But Amis was there at one of them when I was there for the weekend. And, I would see him. He was reading Moby Dick at the time, I remember. This was about 8 years ago, so I suppose he would have been in his late 60s, maybe. And I could have spoken to him then, but I really felt no desire to, I mean, partly because the peak of my adoration and fascination with him and his work had certainly passed. It's interesting. There are a few authors who I was once extremely passionate about, who I remain so, but mostly it doesn't sustain forever like that, and that's perfectly natural. Like Roberto Bolaño, I kind of feel that my passion and my engagement with his work is as intense now as it was in my mid-20s, but with Amis less so. But also the other thing about Amis, that stopped me from wanting to really go and say hello, and is that I do find him, and I did find him, I don't know, off-putting, intimidating. I mean, he didn't seem like a particularly nice or lovable guy. He wasn't a warm, approachable figure. He kind of made a virtue of that, or he made a point of it. He was clearly very agonistic as a person, and he was always up against it, and he had his enemies, and he cultivated his enemies. And, I think he had an air of kind of being embattled, and an air of kind of rancorousness about him, just in general, not just when I saw him, no doubt from years and years of being in the trenches, But the other thing about Amis that needs to be said is the reason he didn't get all those accolades in the UK in his lifetime, I'm sure it had nothing to do with the quality of his writing, which only a liar or a fool would contest. But it probably had a lot to do with the fact that there was a very real element of invidiousness to him. There was something about him that seemed, to me anyway, to compulsively revel in making people resent him, making people hate him. He seemed to get a kick out of it. And, he wrote with real cruelty about any number of writers. In his critical writings, he could be vicious, and you wouldn't want to be on the receiving end of that.
Does this standoffishness you describe represent something that was intrinsically English about him? What did Martin Amis reveal to you about England and the English?
Honestly, something not altogether pleasant, put it that way, I mean, he does. Martin Amis, with all his pathologies and all his maybe failings as a person and all the kind of ugliness and the evil and the darkness that he wallows in, and he consciously explores in his literature and explores with great genius. It was certainly, for me, it was always a very telling, revealing portal into Englishness. Being Irish, growing up in Ireland, it's inevitable that you, particularly when you're very young, through a kind of osmosis, you do look upon the English and the British with a kind of fear, wariness, enmity, as a kind of general, as a general kind of state, as the old oppressors. Like, that stuff runs deep in the kind of cultural imagination, and a kind of fear that it could happen again. And, the idea that we're living next door to a big kind of bully boy, a kind of an imperialistic master, and with their kind of football hooligan shock troops, all these kind of rough and ready characters who he wrote so well about. And so reading Martin Amis, because he isn't kind of trying to uphold some political vision of England or of Englishness or some moral kind of vision of things, he's just kind of giving you what he sees and what he experiences, and he's giving you his own embodiment of that essence as well. It was just a great way to kind of get up close and study something of the English mentality and the English kind of cultural DNA.
He was always up for a fight, and I wonder whether or not it's the Englishman in him that did see the world in oppositional terms, and like his friend Christopher Hitchens, a career made in seeking out battles.
Again, when I was younger, that was very attractive to me, because, you're looking at these established literary titans. What gives them this sense of swagger is their very cruelty and their pugnaciousness, and, Christopher Hitchens as well as Amis, and their warlike mentality and so on. It's far less appealing to me now that I'm in the fray myself and have been for a decade. It's been 10 years since my first book came out, and maybe because all of these guys had been my early heroes, my formative heroes, not just Amis, but Welbeck and people like that, these kind of jihadis of prose, these warriors, these scalp collectors, I probably went into it with some of that spirit myself. And you get bruised, you get into scrapes, and you make enemies, you fight people, and it can be fun for a while. But in my experience, very, very quickly, you lose the taste for it. Maybe one of the reasons why I started to kind of grow away from Amis is that stopped seeming attractive to me.
Janan Ganesh did say you have to get into Martin Amis and you have to get past Martin Amis.
I mean, at the period of my writing life, when I was still aspiring to be a published writer, when I was still figuring all of this stuff out, he was the first and most brilliant example of the sheer necessity and the electricity of style. He was the first and the greatest literary stylist whose work I fell in love with. And when I was trying to figure it all out in the early years, style was everything to me. That's what I valued in a writer, was style. Anything else kind of came second, and nobody did it better, really. One thing I will say, the nonfiction, and I think I wouldn't be surprised if Jeff Dyer, when he was talking to you, made a similar point, because I think I've heard him say it in conversation, or we've agreed with this in conversation. But the nonfiction, the essays and the critical writings and so on, I think they kind of seem to hold up, but they don't seem to have aged maybe as much as the fictional work, you know?
He pretty much made this exact point.
Did he? Yeah, yeah.
As have many, to be fair.
Yeah, as have many. Yeah, yeah. I mean, recently I went back and reread Amos's hilarious and extremely cruel but very, very funny review of Hannibal by Thomas Harris, which is I think it's in The War Against Cliché. You know, it was this big blockbuster novel at the time, and it was getting all of these ecstatic reviews from people who should have known better, who were calling it a great kind of work of literature. And Amos kind of comes out and says, look, I was happy to hold my tongue on this one. You know, I was going to let the populace have their moment, but it's gone too far, so I'm going to have to viciously. And he rips it apart.
Yeah,
you know,
with a nice bottle of Chianti.
Yeah, exactly. It was an act of cannibalism. So yeah, I still love going back to the nonfiction and the essays, but the style. I don't think necessarily these days he's a big influence on my own style, but I do think that the lesson went in deep, and the neuronal charge of the sentences had a lasting impact.
Let's end then with the sentences. What will be your last passage from London Fields, Rob?
So it feels only fitting if I read a passage about darts, because we talked a lot about Keith Talent, but when I think of Keith Talent, the first thing I think of is darts. And when I think of darts, when I see darts, when I hear about darts, the first thing I think of is Keith Talent. And I have a feeling that anybody who's read this book is going to be in the same, is going to be of the same mentality. It's one of the great kind of running jokes in any novel I can think of is his almost mystical devotion to the game of darts, and his endless, almost philosophizing and mythologizing this game and making something so very, very simple. You know, you throw the darts at the board into something so laden with meaning and mythos and passion and frenzy.
Another great example in Amos's work of collapsing the high into the low.
Absolutely.
Or bringing the low up into the heavens.
Yeah. And by the way, there was that one bit, I don't think it's in this passage, but towards the end, you know, when he's playing the final contest and the chant starts up, I remember, and, you know, all the fans are gathering around. By the end, they're only chanting, darts, 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 darts. All of this passion and all of this philosophy has been reduced to its purest form as this one word.
And if you listen very carefully anywhere in central London, you can almost hear the chants from Alexandra Palace on a weekend of darts, darts, darts. I was going to ask you earlier whether of his big three novels, the novels that you've been fixated on for some time, whether they continue to be relevant London novels. I think in a sense, London Fields stays relevant for darts alone.
Absolutely. In the age that the reign of Luke Littler, Keith Talent is a kind of a patron saint, you know. My first dart hit the 3-3. Insincere dart, said Keith. My second missed the board altogether, smacking into the wall cabinet. Not clinicism, said Keith. My third I never threw. On the backswing, the plastic flake jabbed me in the eye. After I'd recovered from that, my scores went 11, 2, 9, 4, 17, outer bullseye, 25, 7, 13, 5. Around now, Keith stopped talking about the sincerity of the dart and started saying, throw it right for Christ's sake, and get the fucking thing in there. On and on it went. Keith grew silent, grieving, priestly. At one point, having thrown 2 darts into the bare wall, I dropped the third and reeled backwards from the oak, saying, most recklessly, that darts was a dumb game and I didn't care anyway. Keith calmly pocketed his darts, stepped forward, and slammed me against a heap of packing cases. Our noses were almost touching again. You don't never show no respect for the darts, okay? He said. You don't never show no respect for the darts. You don't never show no respect for the darts. The second lesson was a nightmare too. The third is tonight. Warily, I eye my pimpish darts pouch. 69.95. Darts compris, courtesy of Keith.
Keith Talent lives forever. How old do you think he was in the novel?
Yeah, I think I have this funny memory that he was 28?
29.
29. And I remember thinking he was younger than I expected. You know, when I reread it, I think I startled on that because then I was a bit older. You know, when you're young, when you read stuff, you always imagine all the characters are way, way older than yourself, you know, and then you reach a certain age where you realize they're the same age or they're younger than you, you know, and that's presumably only going to get worse as I advance through life.
Well, Rob, thank you so much for joining me on the first episode of My Master Name is For 2026, and congratulations on the publication of your new novel, Cameo. Thank you once again.
My great pleasure. Thank you, Jack.